What's going on, everyone? Welcome back to my channel and another installment in my Halloween review series, where each month I review all the Halloween movies I haven't discussed yet in the lead up to Halloween Ends. And today we're talking about Halloween 2. Before we begin, let me know in the comments what your thoughts on this movie were, if you already saw it, or if you were planning on seeing it, and make sure to hit that thumbs up button if you like these reviews, as it helps me out immensely by getting my content out there. And if you're new here, I hope you consider hitting that subscribe button so you can stay up to date with reviews of new releases, older films, hidden gems, and so much more on a near daily basis. But let's not waste any more time, and let's talk about Halloween 2. This sees Donald Pleasance return as Dr. Loomis, who continues his hunt for Michael Myers while a traumatized Laurie, played again by Jamie Lee Curtis, is rushed to Haddonfield Memorial Hospital, where the Shape is not far behind her. So, as I've done previously with all my other retro reviews, this will get into spoilers. So, if you haven't seen Halloween 2 by now and you wish to know nothing, this is your spoiler warning. Go watch the movie, then come back to this. But anyway, here we go. Rick Rosenthal takes over as director from John Carpenter in his directorial debut, though Carpenter returns as a screenwriter along with Deborah Hill, who also co-wrote the first film with Carpenter. And this picks up right where the original 1978 film left off, with the ending of that film being the beginning of this, as it looked to conclude the saga between Laurie and Michael after the cliffhanger ending of the first movie. And considering how many movies we have in this series, we all know how that went. And from here on out, until we get to the first Rob Zombie film, these are all first-time watches for me. I never bothered with most of these sequels, primarily because when it came to horror sequels, particularly slasher films, I was well aware of their reputation for being not just inferior to the original film, but really bad. And before I started this channel, very rarely did I watch any sequels to horror movies beyond the iconic first film, with some exceptions like Scream, Saw, and A Nightmare on Elm Street. Now, while this one's nowhere near as beloved as the original film, this doesn't quite fit the narrative that these sequels are all that bad. This didn't exactly receive the greatest reception at the time. However, in the grand scheme of things, when you look back at all the Halloween sequels, this is one of the few that has something of a following, and it has its defenders. And it makes sense, considering since it picked up right where the first film left off, it can make for a solid back-to-back double feature with that film. However, while I appreciate that aspect about this, I don't think I'd find myself in the camp of wanting to go back and revisit this. Now, I don't hate this film, but if this is considered one of the better entries, I don't even want to think about where things are headed when we get to what's considered some of the worst entries. Now, I don't want to start off just trashing this film left and right, as I do think there are some commendable qualities. Going back briefly to that note about it being a good back-to-back double feature with the original, in terms of capturing the look and John Carpenter's style that he brought to the first film, I think this recreates that nicely. It's not perfect, and I'll get into that in a second, but in terms of the general aesthetic, I do appreciate the consistency there. Likewise, the performances are pretty solid here, at least the two leads. Both Donald Pleasance and Jamie Lee Curtis are once again strong. While I do have some issues with their respective characterizations, I think the actors both manage to make something out of nothing. Loomis mainly continues his quest to hunt Michael down, while this time, Laurie gets considerably more to do. Unlike the first film where she's not actively fighting against Michael until the last 15 minutes, here the stakes are much more personal for her right from the get-go, and in more ways than one, which we'll get to. But she knows she has a target on her back, and her trying to figure out where to go from here gives her much more of a defining arc, which I liked, because one of my few criticisms or really nitpicks of the first film is that despite Jamie Lee Curtis's performance in that film, I honestly don't think Laurie was one of the most interesting characters in the original film. She just happened to be in the wrong place at the wrong time, and the way I see it, she doesn't become a more interesting character until later on. Though to be fair, the only other Laurie-focused sequels I saw until now were 2018 and Kills. And then, for better or worse, the film ups the ante when it comes to the violence and the gore, leaning much more into its slasher elements. It doesn't make it scarier than the original movie by any means, because the first film relied much more heavily on atmosphere to set the mood, especially through Carpenter's iconic score, and you do hear that score again here, but it feels much more like background noise than something that drives the scene forward. But if you like bloodier slasher movies, I can't see you being disappointed as far as it goes here. As I said in my review of the original film, Halloween, despite being one of the films to kick off the slasher craze, isn't exactly as violent or bloody as the films it inspired. I mean, sure, you see Michael Myers killing a few people, but those are relatively tame than what we're used to seeing in your typical slasher. Here though, it cranks things up a notch. Like, there's a moment towards the end where Michael gets shot through the face and he's bleeding through the eyes, and it gushes out. That's the level of violence we're dealing with here. And for some, that might be strong enough that they enjoy this movie. When it comes to slasher films, as long as they're made well enough, there are those audiences who sit down with these movies and want nothing more than whichever villain it is wreaking havoc for 90 minutes or so. And if you're in that camp, you'll probably have a good time with this, and I totally get it. There are a fair share of movies that I enjoy because they're mindlessly entertaining for whatever genre it is they're leaning into, whether it be an action movie, a slasher movie, or whatever. But I couldn't quite get there with this, because the way this cranks up the violence here, I didn't particularly always find it entertaining. If you're going to up the ante on the violence in a movie like this, you need to almost go a little over the top. Maybe not flat out cartoonish, but there needs to be this consistently heightened sense to these moments if what you're looking to deliver is popcorn entertainment. But here, you'll have these sequences which play a larger part into the film's bigger issues, where they're dragged out and violent, but they felt uncomfortable and nothing more. And what doesn't help either is that most of these interactions are filled with characters who are introduced in one scene, and in the very next, they're killed by Michael. But it was only in a few moments where I felt there was any sort of creativity in these moments, or there was any sense of stylization. Like, one of my favorite scenes in the entire movie involves when Loomis goes after someone who he thinks is Michael because he's dressed similarly, and he meets an unfortunate fate in one of the most ridiculous ways possible. But that's also not the tone of the entire movie, which leads into that bigger issue that I hinted at. While yes, as I said, in terms of just the look, it's consistent with the original film, in terms of everything else, you can really notice the dramatic dip in quality. It becomes clear within like the first few minutes that this wasn't meant to be a story or structure that was simply continued for another 90 minutes. The fact it ends where it does in the first film, while not necessarily the most satisfying in a way, given that Michael disappears in the last few seconds, it's still cut off at the perfect time. This just picks up where that film left off and continues on, just now without the strong themes of exploring evil, which was a focal point of the original film. There's nothing inherently unique or interesting about continuing where we left off with these characters, because it just offers more of the same. And sometimes more of the same can be a good thing, like if it ain't broke, why try to fix it? But even when that's the case, when it comes to sequels of any sort, from any genre, you need to find a way to expand on the story, and outside of the one big plot point that we'll get into in a moment, this literally didn't do that at all. And you can pick up on that pretty quickly, like going back to Dr. Loomis. Again, Donald Pleasance is good here, and he does what he can with the material. But Loomis goes from being one of the most intriguing, cooler parts of the first film, and he almost becomes something of a parody of himself here. He mostly regurgitates a lot of the same lines that he said in the first, and whenever he veers from some of those talking points, there are times he clearly sounds silly. Like in the first few minutes, picking up right from that iconic exchange about Michael being the boogeyman, he goes out to examine the spot where Michael lands before disappearing, and then he spends the next 10 to 15 minutes or so running around the streets and screaming to whoever he can that he shot Michael. And he doesn't just say it once. He says it over and over and over again. He'll say it multiple times to the same person as the first thing he says to them. It borders on cartoonish, like in the way Evil Dies Tonight is repeated as heavily as it was in Kills. So it takes this character who was full of mystery and intrigue in the first film and provided something of the emotional core of that film and reduces him to almost a raving lunatic. He'll either tell everyone how he shot Michael 6 times, or he'll just repeat some of the same shtick that he said in the first film. And while Pleasance does what he can, and I think his actual performance salvaged things to a degree, it's still a giant waste of a talented actor. And then the next hour or so finds this movie spinning its wheels. You have Loomis one step behind again, Laurie incapacitated in the hospital, and now you have Michael lurking about town and killing all these random characters who are literally just introduced to die. And again, if these moments mostly took on a tone that it was meant to be a bit heightened and over the top, it would have given this film more of a sense of fun. But as I said, a lot of these moments wind up just being uncomfortable for the sake of it. The tone is meant to be a much more self-serious vibe. Yet, when you have a 90-minute movie filled with like 50 to 60 minutes of Michael killing random people who we never met before, it gives these sequences no emotional factor whatsoever. I mean, say what you want about most of the characters in the original. At least we spend some time with them that accounts for more than one brief 5-minute scene. It at least gives us something to work with, even if we only learn so much about them. Again, I know with slasher movies there's a certain expectation when it comes to the levels of gore and thrills and all that, but an overly serious movie that's primarily made up of characters who are present for only one scene or two, it only gets you so far. And because of that tone, the film drags a lot, actually. Again, it's clear this wasn't meant to be a story that was meant to occur over two movies. Or if it was, Carpenter and Hill certainly didn't have it planned out as well as the first, because some scenes will meander and take forever to get to the point. I mean, I get wanting to set a mood. I've especially seen my fair share of horror movies that are reliant on slow burn, moody little thrills, and while that's not the tone this is meant to go for, you can certainly mistake that for being the case here. Some of these scenes will place its focus on characters having the most mundane conversations that will go on for a while before getting killed off by Michael in the very same scene. Or we'll suspect Michael is present in the room, but it takes forever to actually seeing him show his face, and it doesn't really effectively build towards it in a grand way. Some of these sequences that clearly hint towards Michael about to show up will have some flat direction and dull cinematography, with a lot of basic shot, reverse shot, wide setups that do absolutely nothing. No sense of claustrophobia or clever use of the score to get really under your skin or anything. I mean, when we get to the actual payoff, sometimes it would make the wait kind of worth it, but not all the time, so that would be very disappointing and frustrating. But then we get to the big moment, the one that became a defining point for the series for decades, and that's Laurie and Michael are actually siblings, and Laurie was adopted at an early age. Now, that was always something I knew was a thing for years. Even with not having seen this film or many of the other sequels, I was well aware it became such an integral part of the series. But I never realized till now how much I actually hated it. Like, I don't hate this movie, to be clear, but I really hate this plot twist. And not even just for the sake of it. Like, if there was a compelling reason for why we got this reveal, then of course, I'm all for it. But this adds literally nothing to the storyline. It's just a way of trying to give some humanity to Michael. Like, the reason he's going after Laurie has to do with the fact that they're siblings. But here's the thing. For one thing, the nature of this reveal essentially goes against whatever Carpenter was exploring in the first movie. The whole point of the first film was exploring this idea that someone might just be pure evil and have no true motivation. That's Michael Myers, and if you want to take a different route than that, it's fine. It's just, in a sense, it makes it feel like there was ultimately no point to whatever you wanted to say with your first movie, because you're now trying to retroactively give him a concrete motivation that doesn't line up with that film. And then, even if you're forgiving of that, like, even if you don't mind that about face, the execution is above all else lazy and contrived. For one thing, the way it tries to foreshadow this moment felt very hokey, mainly in the sequences where we circle back to Laurie in the hospital, and the way they try placing such an emphasis on her going like, but why me? Like, it's not even just a throwaway line. There's such a heavy-handed focus on that particular statement that they make it way too obvious they're teeing up to something. And this is probably the one part of the movie I thought that wasn't the best acted, though I don't necessarily blame Jamie Lee Curtis for that. But then, on top of all that, Laurie doesn't actually find out this piece of information by the end of the film. It doesn't add to her arc, she doesn't have this huge revelation or anything, Loomis knows it, we as the audience know it, but she doesn't. You could have cut that revelation out of the film, and her arc would have been the same. Like, you could have had this whole brilliant storyline where she does question why Michael is after her, and she struggles to accept the very thing we explored in the original film, how some people might just be motivated by nothing but pure evil. We could have seen how that played into her trauma and how it shaped her worldview. It could have actually made for a very compelling sequel, but instead, we get this twist that felt so forced in its execution, adding nothing to the story and otherwise just contradicting what we got in the first film. Though, for what it's worth, we do at least get what's meant to be a solid conclusion to the story, where Loomis causes an explosion which engulfs Michael in flames and sees him collapse in what seems to be a definitive ending for him, and what you think would be Loomis as well, as we see him get caught up in the explosion as well, and we don't see him again. And as I said, this was meant to be a conclusion to the saga, so I like that it at least attempted to end things on a concrete note. And now, it's become a staple that Michael always finds a way to survive these violent incidents no matter what. My only question is, since we come back to Loomis in the fourth film, I really want to know how he survived that one. Halloween 2 is a mixed bag that While I didn't hate it, I found it to be a major step down from the iconic first film. On one hand, it does a nice job of picking up where that first film left off, acting as a companion piece to it and doubling down on its gory slasher thrills, which I'm sure will satisfy fans of the genre. However, it's also clear that there really wasn't much left to this story to tell after the first film's famous cliffhanger sequence, and as a result, it spins its wheels for an hour and a half without as much of the chilling atmosphere and strong themes that defined the first film. On top of the fact that it contains a somewhat ludicrous twist in its revelation of Laurie and Michael being siblings that not only contradicts everything explored in the first film, but is also presented in a way that it adds absolutely nothing. You might enjoy it as a basic slasher movie, and it was serviceable at times, but it's nothing I need to revisit. Halloween 2 gets a 5 out of 10. Such a disappointment. Not the worst thing out there, but you can definitely see that dip in quality from the first film. Though we're about to get into something really different in the only film to not feature Michael Myers, Halloween 3 Season of the Witch. Stay tuned for that review on the way, but in the meantime, let me know. Did you see Halloween 2, or are you planning to see it, and what were your thoughts? Is this one of your favorite of the sequels, or do you not like it so much? Let me know in the comments below so we can discuss. Also, if you enjoyed this video, please give it a like and share it. And for more movie reviews and film discussion, please make sure to hit that subscribe button to stay updated. Thanks for watching, everyone, and keep having fun with film.